A poor boy is mocked at school, but his response leaves everyone speechless. But before that, consider subscribing to the channel so we can keep sharing amazing stories. Jack trudged through the school gates, his small frame burdened not just by the weight of his worn-out backpack, but by the invisible load of his circumstances. The morning air was crisp, but the chill that crept through the holes in his threadbare shoes made it hard to ignore the stark difference between him and the other students. His clothes, clearly hand-me-downs, hung loosely on his thin body, their faded colors a silent testimony to the many years they had served his older brothers before him. As he walked through the crowded hallways, the whispers began. They were subtle, just out of earshot, but Jack had grown used to them. He knew what they were saying. How could he not? The snickers and side glances, the mockery of his appearance, his poverty, all had become a daily ritual. His classmates, dressed in the latest fashion trends with bright, clean sneakers that shone under the fluorescent lights, seemed to exist in a different world. A world where Jack didn't belong. But what they didn't see, what no one seemed to notice, was the fire in Jack's eyes. His outward appearance might have been worn, but inside, Jack carried a determination as strong as steel. He had learned long ago that life wasn't fair, and that to survive, he had to be stronger, smarter, and more resilient than those around him. His mind, sharp as a tack, absorbed information like a sponge, and while others were busy mocking, he was quietly outpacing them in every subject. Yet, for all his intelligence, Jack couldn't escape the sting of the taunts. Every cruel word, every pointed finger felt like a slap, a reminder of everything he didn't have. But Jack had also learned to hide the pain, to push it down deep where no one could see. His face remained impassive, his stride steady, as he made his way to his classroom, ignoring the snide comments and the pitying looks from those who saw him as nothing more than the poor kid. Inside the classroom, Jack took his usual seat at the back, away from the prying eyes and the scornful laughter. He pulled out his tattered notebook, the pages filled with meticulous notes, and prepared for another day of learning. But as the bell rang and the teacher began to speak, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. There was something in the air, a tension that made his skin prickle. He pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the lesson at hand. Jack's focus was intense, but the weight of his reality was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. He knew that at any moment, another insult could be thrown his way, another test of his patience and resolve. But he was ready, as always, to face whatever came his way, determined not to let the cruelty of others define him. During the lunch break, Jack found his usual spot in the quiet corner of the schoolyard, a place where he could lose himself in the pages of his book, away from the relentless noise of his classmates. The book was old, its spine cracked and pages yellowed, but it was his sanctuary, a world where he could escape if only for a little while. The words on the page were a refuge, a shield against the harsh realities of his life. But today, even his beloved book couldn't protect him from what was coming. As he turned the page, fully absorbed in the story, the shadow of Brian and his group of followers fell over him. Jack didn't need to look up to know what was about to happen. He had been through this routine too many times. Brian, tall and athletic, was everything Jack wasn't. Confident, wealthy, and surrounded by friends who hung on his every word. Where Jack was quiet and thoughtful, Brian was loud and cruel, and he took great pleasure in reminding Jack of his place in the school's social hierarchy. "Hey, Jack." Brian's voice cut through the air like a knife dripping with mockery. "What's that you're reading? A book on how to be poor?" The group erupted in laughter, their voices echoing off the brick walls of the school. Jack's grip on the book tightened, but he kept his eyes on the page, willing himself to remain calm, to not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. Undeterred by Jack's silence, Brian stepped closer, his sneaker-clad foot tapping the ground impatiently. "Look at those clothes," he sneered, pointing to Jack's worn-out jacket. "Did you get that from the dumpster, or was it a hand-me-down from your great-grandfather?" The laughter grew louder, more vicious, but Jack kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the words that now blurred on the page. Brian wasn't finished. With a swift motion, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a shiny coin, flicking it with his thumb. The coin spun in the air, catching the light before landing with a clink at Jack's feet. "There you go, Jack," Brian said, his voice thick with sarcasm. "Why don't you pick that up? Consider it a tip, for being such a good sport." The taunt hung in the air, and for a moment, Everything seemed to stop. Jack stared at the coin, his face betraying no emotion. But inside, a storm was brewing. The other boys watched with eager anticipation, waiting for Jack to finally crack, to see him reduced to the image they had of him. A poor, helpless kid, grateful for even the smallest scrap of kindness, no matter how twisted. But Jack didn't move. He didn't bend down to pick up the coin. Instead, he remained still, his mind racing as he weighed his next move. He knew that whatever he did next would be remembered, that this moment could define him in the eyes of his peers. And while Brian and his gang saw only a poor boy with no future, Jack knew better. He wasn't going to give them the reaction they expected. Jack's heart raced, but outwardly he remained calm. He slowly closed his book, carefully placing it beside him, and looked up at Brian and the group of boys with a confidence that caught them off guard. The usual target of their taunts, Jack, had always been quiet, almost submissive. But today something was different. He saw the coin gleaming at his feet, a symbol of their mockery, but also an opportunity. Without breaking eye contact, Jack bent down and picked up the coin. The act itself was deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he were collecting something of immense value rather than a mere token of humiliation. He turned the coin over in his hand, feeling its weight, and then slowly stood up. A small, confident smile tugged at the corners of his mouth as he raised his head, his eyes meeting Brian's, with a steady, unwavering gaze. In a voice clear and firm, Jack spoke, and his words were like a knife slicing through the thick air of anticipation. "You see this coin?" he began, holding it up so everyone could see. "To you it might be nothing, just something you throw away, something to mock someone like me. But for me, this coin represents something more." His voice carried a strength that silenced the whispers, drawing the attention of more students around them. Jack paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. "I may not have what you have. I don't wear the latest clothes, I don't have money to waste, and yes, my life isn't easy. But this coin doesn't define me, just like your wealth doesn't define you. My wealth isn't in my pocket, it's in my heart and in my mind. It's in the courage I have to stand here and tell you that you can throw as many coins at me as you want, but you'll never be able to buy what I have." He looked around at the faces now turned towards him, a mixture of curiosity and surprise in their eyes. Jack could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the power of his words resonating in the silence that followed. "Courage," he repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "That's something no amount of money can buy, and with that courage, I'll go further than any of you can imagine." Jack's smile grew a little wider as he tossed the coin back to Brian, who reflexively caught it, his smirk fading as he did. Jack stood taller now, the weight of their mockery lifted, replaced by a newfound sense of pride. He didn't need to say anything more. His actions had spoken louder than any insult they could ever throw at him. The moment lingered, heavy with the realization that something had shifted. Jack, the boy they had mocked for so long, had just stood up to them in a way that none of them expected, in a way that none of them could quite comprehend. The moment Jack's words left his mouth, the entire schoolyard seemed to freeze. The usual hum of lunchtime chatter was replaced by a heavy, stunned silence. It was as if the air itself had thickened, holding everyone in place, capturing them in the aftermath of something profound. The mocking smirks on the faces of Brian and his friends faded, replaced by expressions of confusion, even discomfort. They had expected Jack to cower, to fumble for words, to confirm the image they had of him in their minds. But instead, he had done the unthinkable. He had stood up to them, and in a way that none of them had anticipated. Brian, usually so quick with a retort, found himself speechless. His hand, still holding the coin Jack had tossed back to him, hung awkwardly at his side. The confidence that had defined him moments earlier had evaporated, leaving him unsure of how to respond. He glanced around at his friends, looking for support, but found none. They too were at a loss, their bravado deflated by Jack's unexpected defiance. One by one, the boys began to back away, their earlier laughter replaced by an uneasy silence. Their feet shuffled on the gravel, the only sound breaking the stillness, as they retreated, avoiding eye contact with Jack. It was a quiet, almost shameful retreat, as if they were fleeing from a battlefield where they had suffered an unexpected defeat. Jack, on the other hand, stood tall. The weight of the moment hung in the air, but he bore it with a dignity that belied his years. His calm demeanor was unshaken, his resolve firm as he watched the boys disperse. There was no need for him to gloat or to follow up with more words. The silence that enveloped them was victory enough. Jack had made his point, and it echoed louder in the silence than any retort ever could. Slowly, he turned away from the dispersing crowd and walked back to his spot under the tree. His movements were deliberate, almost serene, as if he were returning to a place of peace after a storm. He picked up his book, which had lain undisturbed on the grass, and sat down, his back straight, his eyes focused. It was as if nothing had happened, as if the confrontation had been a mere ripple in his day. Yet something had shifted within him, a new strength, a newfound sense of self-worth that no one could take from him. Around him, the other students watched in awe, their earlier indifference replaced by respect, or at least a newfound awareness of who Jack really was. No one dared approach him, no one dared break the silence that had fallen over the yard. Jack had spoken, and his words still hung in the air, a testament to his courage and integrity. Jack's return to his book was not an act of dismissal, but rather a quiet affirmation of who he was. He didn't need their approval or their recognition. He had already found something far more valuable within himself. The silence that followed him back to his seat wasn't one of defeat, but of realization, both for Jack and for those who had witnessed the exchange. And as he resumed reading, the world seemed to shift around him, acknowledging, even if silently, the quiet power that he now held. In the days that followed Jack's bold stand, the atmosphere in the school began to change. His words had struck a chord, not just with Brian and his friends, but with many of the other students as well. The usual chatter and gossip that filled the hallways took on a different tone, one of introspection and quiet discussion. Jack's quiet strength had sparked a reflection among his peers, forcing them to confront their own behavior and attitudes. Some of the students who had previously joined in the teasing or simply stood by and watched found themselves replaying Jack's words in their minds. For the first time, they questioned the casual cruelty that had become so ingrained in their interactions. It wasn't just about Jack anymore. It was about the way they treated each other, the way they measured worth by material possessions and social status. Jack's stand had opened their eyes to the pettiness of their actions, and it left many feeling uneasy, even guilty. Brian, in particular, was deeply affected. The arrogance that had once defined him now felt hollow. The confidence he had wielded like a weapon seemed to have evaporated. He found himself avoiding Jack, unable to meet his eyes in the hallways. The memory of Jack's unwavering gaze and the truth in his words haunted Brian, casting a long shadow over his once unchallenged dominance. He realized with growing discomfort that his sense of superiority had been based on nothing more than shallow assumptions and empty pride. As the days passed, Brian's discomfort grew into a quiet shame. He began to distance himself from the group of boys who had once been his loyal followers, their shared laughter now tinged with an edge he could no longer ignore. The hierarchy that had once seemed so natural, so unshakable, now felt fragile, as if a single word from Jack could topple it entirely. Brian couldn't shake the feeling that he had been exposed, not just to the school, but to himself. The subtle shift in the school's atmosphere was palpable. Jack's presence in the classroom and in the hallways was no longer something to be mocked, but rather something to be respected, even if from a distance. The students who once teased him now found themselves unsure of how to interact with him, caught between their old habits and a newfound respect that they didn't quite know how to express. Jack, for his part, remained quiet and focused, seemingly unaffected by the changes around him. He continued to go about his day with the same calm determination that had characterized his stand against Brian, but there was a noticeable difference in how others perceived him. He had become a symbol of something more, something that resonated deeply with the students who were now rethinking their own behavior. The school had become a quieter place, not in volume, but in the undercurrents of thought that now flowed through it. Jack's words had left an indelible mark, one that would linger in the minds of his peers long after the echoes of the confrontation had faded. Jack's newfound resolve began to manifest itself in the one place where he had always found solace: his studies. While the atmosphere in the school shifted, with students reflecting on their own behaviors, Jack channeled all his energy into his academic work. The classroom, which had once been a place of silent suffering for him, now became a stage where his true potential began to shine. Day after day, Jack immersed himself in his books, his focus unwavering. His mind, already sharp, seemed to become even more attuned to the challenges presented in class. He answered questions with confidence, solved problems that left others scratching their heads, and completed assignments with a precision that caught the attention of his teachers. It wasn't that Jack had suddenly become smarter. Rather, it was as if a weight had been lifted, freeing him to fully embrace the potential that had always been there. Word of Jack's academic prowess began to spread among the teachers. Mr. Thompson, his math teacher, was particularly impressed. He had always known that Jack was capable, but now he saw a spark in the boy that was impossible to ignore. Mr. Thompson watched as Jack tackled complex equations with ease, his mind working through the numbers with a clarity and speed that rivaled even the brightest students in the class. It wasn't long before Mr. Thompson approached Jack with an opportunity that he couldn't pass up, a chance to represent the school in a regional math competition. The competition was known for being tough, attracting some of the most talented young minds from across the region. For many students, it was an honor simply to be considered, but for Jack, it represented something more. It was a chance to prove, not just to others but to himself, that he was more than the labels people had placed on him. Despite the challenges he faced, balancing his schoolwork, helping out at home, and dealing with the lingering effects of his classmates' earlier mockery, Jack accepted the invitation with quiet determination. He knew that this was his moment, a chance to step out of the shadows and into the light of recognition that he had long deserved. As the days leading up to the competition passed, Jack dedicated himself to preparing. Every spare moment was spent studying, practicing problems, and refining his understanding of the material. He was tireless in his efforts, driven by a deep desire to succeed, not just for the sake of winning, but for the sense of accomplishment that would come with knowing he had given his all. His teachers noticed the change in him. The quiet boy who had once been the target of scorn was now the subject of admiration. They saw in Jack a potential that was finally being realized, a brilliance that had been hidden beneath the surface for far too long. And though Jack's peers were still adjusting to the new dynamic, there was no denying that he had become someone worth paying attention to. As the day of the competition approached, Jack's confidence grew. He wasn't just preparing for a contest, he was preparing for a moment that could redefine his future. And while the outcome of the competition remained uncertain, one thing was clear. Jack was no longer the boy who sat quietly in the back of the class, unnoticed and underestimated. He was ready to show the world what he was truly capable of. The school buzzed with anticipation, the students and teachers alike sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Jack's transformation had set the stage for a new chapter, one where his intelligence and determination would finally take center stage. The day of the math competition arrived, and the atmosphere in the school was electric. The event had become a topic of conversation among students and teachers alike, with many eager to see how Jack, the once overlooked student, would perform against some of the brightest minds from other schools. The auditorium was filled with a mix of anticipation and curiosity as the audience gathered to witness the competition. Jack entered the auditorium with a calm demeanor, though the magnitude of the moment wasn't lost on him. He glanced around, taking in the sea of faces, some familiar, some not, but all focused on the upcoming challenge. The other competitors, many dressed in crisp uniforms and sporting confident expressions, exuded an air of privilege and preparation. They had the support of their schools, their families, and their peers. But Jack had something else, a quiet resolve that had been forged through adversity. As Jack took his seat at the front, he noticed Brian and his usual group of friends sitting toward the back of the room. Their expressions were a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Though they had distanced themselves from their previous mockery, old habits died hard. They were here to watch, perhaps still expecting Jack to falter under the pressure. But Jack didn't let their presence rattle him. He had long since learned to tune out the noise. The competition began, and the tension in the room became palpable. Each round brought a new set of challenges, with problems designed to test not just knowledge, but creativity and critical thinking. The other competitors moved through the rounds with practiced ease, their confidence evident in the way they tackled each problem. Jack, however, approached each question with a methodical calm, his mind fully engaged in finding the best solutions. The first round passed, then the second, and Jack's name remained near the top of the leaderboard. Whispers spread through the audience as they began to realize that Jack wasn't just holding his own, he was excelling. His focus was unbreakable, his mind sharp, and his answers precise. With each correct answer, Jack felt his confidence grow, bolstered by the knowledge that he belonged here, competing alongside the best. Brian watched from the back, a sense of unease creeping over him. This wasn't the Jack he had known, the quiet, easily dismissed boy he had once ridiculed. This was someone different, someone whose talent and determination were undeniable. For the first time, Brian began to wonder if he had underestimated Jack far more than he had realized. As the competition neared its final round, the tension in the room reached its peak. The remaining problems were the most difficult, designed to separate the best from the rest. Jack could feel the weight of the moment, but he remained calm, his mind working through the complexities with a clarity that surprised even him. The auditorium was silent, every eye fixed on the competitors as they scribbled their answers, the pressure mounting with each passing minute. Jack's heart raced as he completed his final answer, but outwardly, he remained composed. He knew he had done his best, pushed himself to his limits and beyond. As he set down his pencil, he took a deep breath, allowing himself a moment of stillness before the results were announced. The competition had tested him in ways he had never imagined, but he had faced it all with the quiet strength that had carried him through so much already. The auditorium remained hushed, the anticipation thick in the air as everyone awaited the final announcement. The tension in the auditorium was almost unbearable as the judges tallied the final scores. The room was so quiet that even the slightest sound seemed amplified, and everyone's eyes were fixed on the stage where the competitors sat, waiting for the results. Jack sat among them, his hands folded calmly on the desk, his mind still replaying the problems he had solved. He had given everything he had, and now all that was left was to hear the outcome. When the lead judge finally stepped forward to announce the winner, the room seemed to hold its breath. And the first place in this year's math competition goes to... The pause that followed felt like an eternity, each second stretching out, thick with anticipation. Jack Thompson. Then, as the realization hit, the silence was shattered by a wave of applause that rolled through the auditorium, growing louder with each passing second. Jack blinked in surprise, his mind catching up with the fact that he had actually won. And not just won, he had dominated the competition, surpassing even the most privileged and confident of his peers. The applause grew more fervent, accompanied by cheers from his classmates and teachers, who had been watching with bated breath. Jack stood up, his legs feeling slightly unsteady, as if the weight of the moment was finally pressing down on him. He made his way to the stage, where the judges were waiting to congratulate him, their expressions a mixture of respect and admiration. Jack accepted the trophy they handed him, its weight in his hands a tangible symbol of his hard-earned victory. The teachers who had been rooting for him from the start couldn't hide their pride. Mr. Thompson, his math teacher, looked particularly pleased, clapping vigorously as Jack took his place at the center of the stage. The look in Mr. Thompson's eyes spoke volumes. This was a victory that had been long overdue, a recognition of talent that had finally been given its due. As Jack stood there, holding his trophy, he couldn't help but glance toward the back of the room where Brian and his friends sat. The expressions on their faces had shifted from skepticism to something else, something that resembled respect. Brian, who had once led the charge in mocking Jack, now seemed unsure of himself, his usual smirk replaced by a look of grudging acknowledgement. The applause continued, filling the room with a sense of celebration that was almost overwhelming. Jack had done it. He had proven, not just to others but to himself, that he was capable of greatness. The doubts and insecurities that had plagued him for so long seemed to melt away, replaced by a newfound confidence that he knew would stay with him long after the applause had faded. As the cheering subsided, Jack looked out over the crowd, feeling something he had never felt before: acceptance. It wasn't just about the victory, it was about the journey that had led him here, the obstacles he had overcome, and the realization that he was more than the sum of his struggles. He was strong, he was capable, and now he was victorious. The applause finally began to die down, but the impact of Jack's win was far from over. After the competition, the atmosphere at school was charged with excitement and pride. Jack's victory had quickly become the talk of the entire student body, and it wasn't long before the news reached the school's administration. The next morning, as the students gathered for their usual assembly, There was an air of anticipation. Everyone knew something special was about to happen. The school's principal, Mr. Edwards, stepped onto the stage with a broad smile. He rarely addressed the students directly, unless it was for something of great importance, and today was one of those rare occasions. The chatter in the assembly hall died down as Mr. Edwards raised his hand, signaling for silence. "Today," he began, his voice carrying easily across the room, "we have the privilege of recognizing one of our own, a student who has shown remarkable courage, determination, and intellect." He paused, allowing his words to settle in, the weight of what he was about to say adding to the suspense. "Jack Thompson," Mr. Edwards continued, "has not only won the regional math competition, but he did so in a manner that left no doubt about his exceptional abilities. But more than his academic excellence, Jack has demonstrated qualities that we value above all: perseverance in the face of adversity, humility, and the strength to rise above challenges." Jack, sitting among his classmates, felt a rush of emotions: pride, gratitude, and a deep sense of accomplishment. But the principal wasn't done. As the applause faded, Mr. Edwards gestured for Jack to join him on the stage. Jack hesitated for a moment, the enormity of the moment weighing on him. But then he stood up and made his way to the front, the eyes of the entire school upon him. When Jack reached the stage, Mr. Edwards placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture both paternal and respectful. "Jack," the principal said, his voice now filled with warmth, "you've not only brought honor to yourself but to our entire school. And it is with great pleasure that I announce that, in recognition of your outstanding achievements, you have been awarded a full scholarship to Brookfield Academy." Brookfield Academy was one of the most prestigious preparatory schools in the state, a place where opportunities abounded and futures were made. The scholarship wasn't just a prize, it was a life-changing opportunity, one that would open doors Jack had never imagined possible. As the cheers continued, Jack stood there absorbing the moment. He could see the faces of his teachers, beaming with pride, and the expressions of his classmates, some still in shock at the announcement. But what struck him most was the realization that this recognition wasn't just about his academic prowess. It was about who he had become. The boy who had refused to be defined by his circumstances, who had stood up in the face of mockery and had emerged victorious in more ways than one. Mr. Edwards allowed the applause to continue for a few more moments before raising his hand once again to quiet the crowd. "Jack, we are all incredibly proud of you. Your future is bright, and we have no doubt that you will continue to achieve great things. This scholarship is just the beginning." Edwards and the school was more than just an acknowledgement of his abilities. It was a validation of his journey and the hard-fought battles he had won to get here. In the days following the assembly, something unexpected began to unfold. Brian, who had once led the charge in mocking Jack, found himself in a state of deep reflection. The recognition Jack had received from the school and the undeniable respect that now surrounded him forced Brian to confront his own behavior. The memory of his past cruelty toward Jack weighed heavily on him, and for the first time, he felt a pang of guilt that he couldn't shake. Brian had always been at the top of the social ladder, using his influence and sharp tongue to maintain his position. But now, he couldn't help but see the pettiness in his actions. Jack's quiet strength, his ability to rise above the mockery, and his incredible success had shown Brian a different kind of power, one that wasn't based on wealth or popularity, but on character and resilience. One afternoon, after school had let out and most students had gone home, Brian spotted Jack in the courtyard, sitting under the large oak tree where he often studied. Jack was alone, absorbed in a book, as was his usual habit. Brian hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest as he wrestled with his pride and the growing need to make amends. Finally, he gathered his courage and walked over to where Jack sat. Jack looked up as Brian approached, his expression neutral. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of their past interactions hung between them like a dense fog. Brian, struggling to find the right words, finally managed to say, "Jack, I owe you an apology. All those times I made fun of you, treated you like you were less than me. I was wrong. I see that now. You've shown me what real strength looks like, and I'm sorry for everything." It was a moment that Jack had never expected. Brian, the boy who had once tormented him, now standing before him with humility, seeking forgiveness. Jack considered his words carefully. He had every right to hold a grudge, to turn his back on Brian and walk away. But Jack had never been one to hold on to anger, and he understood that forgiveness was a strength in itself. Jack closed his book and stood up, meeting Brian's gaze. "I appreciate that, Brian," he said softly. "It takes a lot to admit when you're wrong. I forgive you." "I'd like that." As they walked together out of the courtyard, it was clear that the dynamics had shifted in a way that neither of them could have predicted. Brian, who had always been surrounded by friends, now found himself with a new kind of companionship, one based on mutual respect rather than fear or dominance. And Jack, who had spent so much time alone, now had someone who, despite their rocky past, was genuinely interested in knowing him for who he truly was. Their friendship was still new, tentative, but it was real, and it marked a significant change in both their lives. As the days passed, the reality of Jack's upcoming transition to Brookfield Academy began to settle in. The scholarship had been a dream come true, but it also meant leaving behind the familiar, his old school, his teachers, and the friends he had made, including his newfound friendship with Brian. Jack knew that Brookfield would present new challenges, not just academically, but socially as well. He would be entering an environment where most students came from wealth and privilege, a world vastly different from his own. But Jack's confidence was unwavering. The experiences he had gone through, the taunts, the bullying, the victory at the math competition, had forged in him a resilience that would carry him through whatever lay ahead. He spent his last days at his current school preparing himself, not just academically, but mentally and emotionally. He knew that his journey was far from over, but he felt ready to face whatever challenges came his way. The school buzzed with a mix of excitement and sadness as word spread about Jack's departure. For many students, Jack had become a symbol of what could be achieved through perseverance and courage. His story had inspired others, and his presence would be missed. On his last day, the school held a small assembly in his honor, where teachers and students alike expressed their admiration and wished him well on his new path. Jack stood at the front of the assembly, looking out at the faces of his classmates and teachers. He felt a mix of emotions, gratitude, pride, and a touch of sadness, but above all he felt a sense of fulfillment. He had come a long way from the boy who had been mocked for his poverty, the boy who had quietly endured the scorn of his peers. Now he was leaving with his head held high, knowing that he had made a difference. As the assembly came to a close, Jack took a moment to reflect on everything that had happened. The lessons he had learned, the friends he had made, and the challenges he had overcome had all shaped him into the person he was now. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Brookfield would present its own set of difficulties, but he was ready. He had faced adversity before, and he had emerged stronger each time. With a final wave to his friends and teachers, Jack left the school grounds, his heart full of hope for the future. He knew that he was stepping into a new chapter of his life, one that would bring new opportunities and new challenges. But he also knew that he was carrying with him the strength and confidence that had been forged in the crucible of his past experiences. And as he walked away from the school that had been his home for so many years, he did so with the knowledge that he was ready for whatever came next. As Jack walked away from the school that had shaped so much of his life, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him to this moment. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow on the familiar buildings behind him, and he felt a sense of closure. He was leaving behind the place where he had faced countless challenges, but also where he had discovered his own strength. Jack knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, but the lessons he had learned here would stay with him forever. The story of Jack's transformation spread quickly through the school. His classmates, who had once seen him as nothing more than the poor kid, now spoke of him with admiration and respect. Jack had taught them a lesson that would linger long after he had gone, a lesson about the true meaning of wealth and success. It wasn't about material possessions or social status. It was about the strength of character, the courage to stand up in the face of adversity, and the determination to rise above the limitations imposed by others. The students who had witnessed Jack's journey began to see themselves and each other differently. They realized that everyone had their own battles to fight, their own challenges to overcome, and that true respect came not from what someone owned, but from who they were at their core. Jack's story became a quiet legend within the school, a source of inspiration for those who might be struggling in their own ways. Teachers also carried Jack's story into their classrooms, using it as an example of resilience and integrity. They reminded their students that while academic success was important, it was the qualities of heart and mind that truly defined a person's worth. Jack had embodied these qualities, and his legacy was one of hope and encouragement for those who followed in his footsteps. As Jack moved forward into his new life, the impact of his time at the school continued to ripple through the lives of those he left behind. His story was a testament to the idea that true wealth is not measured in money or possessions, but in the strength of one's character and the courage to face life's challenges with dignity and grace. In the years to come, students would walk the same halls, sit in the same classrooms, and hear the same lessons. But now they would also hear the story of Jack Thompson, the boy who had proved that greatness lies not in what you have, but in who you are. And in this way, Jack's legacy lived on, inspiring future generations to believe in themselves and to understand that no matter their circumstances, they had the power to shape their own destinies with courage and integrity.